New York will remain a city of immigrants, a city built by immigrants, powered by immigrants, and as of tonight, led by an immigrant. So hear me, President Trump, when I say this. To get to any of us, you will have to get through all of us.
At the top of the show, we heard a little bit of Zoran Mamdani's acceptance speech when he, on Tuesday, found out that he was the mayor-elect of the city of New York. We're going to get to Mamdani in our news focus this week. We're going to be talking about all the elections, but I'm Claire Potter.
I'm Neil Young.
And this is the Political Junkie Substack. So, starting off this week, Neil, God, it's been such a big week already. And it's hard to disaggregate the election news from all the other news that it's been happening. But let's start with the biggie. On Election Day, former Vice President Dick Cheney died in Northern Virginia at 84 from pneumonia, cardiac, and vascular disease. It's a miracle the guy actually was still alive. He's had so many heart problems for so long. He was also the ultimate Washington insider. CNN characterized him as a polarizing Washington power player, and the New York Times calls him a singular figure more powerful and less ambitious for higher office than any vice president in modern times. So can you tell our listeners, some of whom may actually have been too young to know Dick Cheney, why is he so important, Neil?
He's important because I think he really, in many ways, shaped the Republican Party as we know it, although I think there's some interesting questions about how much is he someone who laid the foundation upon which someone like Trump could take over the party, or is he, as others have written, I mean, there's been a lot of commentary that sort of characterized him in different ways, but as the ultimate Washington insider who became an outsider once, it was Trump's GOP. But, this person who long worked within the center of power in Washington, in the GOP establishment as a congressman, as a defense secretary, maybe one of the most important vice presidents we've ever had, certainly one of the most important in modern history, being vice president during the George W. Bush administration and incredibly impacting the foreign policy decisions of that administration, especially, the decisions to go to war.
Well, and many people really saw Cheney as kind of a nanny who had been attached to George W. Bush by his father's people, because who was not actually the sharpest knife in the drawer anyway, had zero foreign policy experience. So there's this great moment when you tells Cheney, come to with a binder full of people who will be good vice presidents. And then a couple days later, Bush gets up in front of the nation and says, actually, the guy next to me, the guy that brought the binder, that's going to be the vice president. So let us remind ourselves that it is Dick Cheney who authorized torture during the war against Iraq and Afghanistan. It is Cheney who is broadly seen to have pushed Bush into the war, certainly in Iraq, maybe in Afghanistan. And then there's some things about the man that are less unlikable. For example, when his daughter Liz was running for the single congressional seat in Wyoming, which Dick himself had, and she came out against gay marriage, knowing full well that her sister Mary was gay and also married to a woman. And Dick and Liz Cheney kind of intervened in that and said, you can't do this to your sister.
Yes, and even going further back, I mean, when he was vice president, and the Defense of Marriage Act was, very much a part of the 2004 campaign. He had spoken, I wouldn't say necessarily in favor of same-sex marriage as much as he voiced, or he sort of indicated that he didn't like these measures that were, on ballot initiatives at the state level to make marriage equality, or it wouldn't have made marriage equality illegal at the time, but to sort of, be extra preventative measures. And, he said something along the lines of, I always believed that freedom applied to everyone. And so there was sort of a libertarian strain in him, especially, I think, on social issues and particularly around LGBTQ issues or the marriage or the issue of same-sex marriage. And I think that's notable.
Yeah, I think it's notable too. It's also worth saying that Liz Cheney eventually apologized to her sister and then became the Liz Cheney we know and love, who is both a war hawk and a fiscal conservative and really stood up against the Trump administration and laid her career on the line for doing that, and undoubtedly put herself in a great deal of physical danger as well. Well, Dick Cheney, our flag is lowered to half-mast at Political Junkies, and God bless you, and don't do anything bad when you're in heaven like you did on earth.
Can we say also that, I just want to add that, the last presidential vote he made was for Kamala Harris. And not only that did that, but he publicly announced he and his family were going to do so. So I think, again, it speaks to not necessarily, I think that we wouldn't use that to characterize his whole political career or to understand his biography. And yet it's also an important moment in that very long career.
Hard agree. And let us also say that Donald Trump has barely acknowledged Dick Cheney's death. Yet another piece of evidence that Trumpism is possibly as impolite as any other political philosophy in American history. Okay, so our next news item is the government shutdown, which is not really remarkable except in one fact, which is it is the longest political shutdown in history, and the previous record was also set in a Donald Trump presidency in the first term. On Election Day, Trump, now under court order to restore SNAP benefits that were suspended this week, said he would partially restore them, but that did not seem to reassure voters, and we'll talk about that later in the show. Senate Majority Leader John Thune has declined to suspend the filibuster to reopen the government, however. 12 Senate Democrats have signaled that they are ready to talk in exchange for a vote on restoring healthcare subsidies, but the Trump administration has instead decided to apply more pressure by reducing flights to 40 major airports. A poll released on Monday shows that 52% of voters hold the Republicans responsible for the shutdown and only 42% blame Democrats. What is there left to say about this government shutdown?
I'm not sure. I mean, I think that it does feel like this isn't going to be resolved anytime soon because, in part, you have, one side, or at least a president who I don't think is willing in any way to show something that he would construe as compromise on his part. So this all has to come on the other side. I mean, we'll see what Democrats do here. I don't know how much this pressure is, going to become unbearable for them and that they do cave on this. But for the time being, it feels like an impasse that's sort of in place. I have a big flight this weekend. I'm certainly nervous about that. I think a lot of Americans are about to be highly inconvenienced, if not worse, by this. And I think that could be potentially a tipping point in terms of just, public outrage. But which way it tips things, I don't really know. I mean, what do you think, Claire?
Well, I wonder if Tuesday's election results gave the Democrats some breathing room. There's certainly some indication in those poll numbers that the shutdown may have had an effect on what seems to have been an overwhelming rejection of Donald Trump last Tuesday. So I think there's that. I think there is also the question of how this shutdown really highlights the collapse of the Republican Party as a functioning entity.
Yes.
And the collapse of the relationship between the president and his party. I mean, normally during a shutdown, the president is in Washington, he's in the White House, he's getting people in, he's twisting their arms, he's trying to, as Trump would say, make a deal. I mean, the government shutdown and the sort of hothouse atmosphere around that was in some ways the context for the Monica Lewinsky scandal and the Clinton administration. And Trump is not doing that. He goes abroad, he goes to Florida, he goes golfing. It's not just that Republicans and Democrats are not really speaking to each other, although it seems like there's some movement in the Senate, but Donald Trump is not speaking to the leadership of his own party. And that's About as scary as sending a professional football team out on the field without a quarterback and just expecting them to figure it out.
Yes, but let's not pretend he's not doing anything. You saw the bathroom he just redecorated in the White House.
Yes, yes. All that lovely marble.
Yes, so it's not like he's isn't busy and not doing important things that matter. Yeah, I think like this is really exposing what has been said for a while about real challenges within this party in terms of, communication and connection between the executive wing or the executive branch and, their own members in Congress. But here it's really sort of plainly exposed in a moment like a government shutdown. Yeah, we'll see. Certainly the election doesn't allow Republicans to sort of walk away from this and pretend like there aren't real things that they have to fix. I just don't know if Republicans are capable of properly diagnosing anything anymore because they have this overbearing, psychology in this particular president that I think distorts everything.
Well, I think you're right. And I think it's interesting to sort of look at it as an emerging psychology because the Republican Party, as far as I can tell, largely functions on social media nowadays. That's how they know what each other is doing. Yeah. That's how they know what each other is thinking. Mike Johnson has sent the House of Representatives away. It's now the 5th week that the House of Representatives has not been in session. So these people are actually paid because Congress is being paid to do nothing. I do think that one of the things we could do to prevent these kinds of performative shutdowns in the future would be to pass a law saying that Congress doesn't get paid during shutdowns.
Seems pretty fair to me.
It does seem pretty fair to me, particularly since we know that a great many people in Congress are operating on very slim budgets. I mean, it's why a lot of these folks, have roommates. Right? They'll rent a whole house and stuff 5 or 6 representatives into it, right? Because they don't have enough money to maintain 2 homes and do all that flying around and so on and so forth. So I think that would be a really good idea for the future. It's hard to know what could possibly break this impasse absent something really horrible happening because, an air traffic controller falls asleep after being on duty for 3 shifts or something like that. Okay, let's move on to our final item. Also on Wednesday, SCOTUS heard arguments in Learning Resources Incorporated v. Trump, a case filed by small businesses and states that challenges President Trump's authority to impose tariffs under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. The case is broadly understood as a test for the conservative majority of the court as to whether they will support the authority of Congress as well as their own authority over constitutional interpretation. Both conservative and liberal judges were skeptical about the Trump administration's case, both in its specifics and in its potentially precedent-setting power to allow presidents to veto legislation retroactively. In the meantime, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent is going on all of the political talk shows and saying that if the tariffs are overturned, the government will have to return as much as $750 billion in revenue that they have collected. And Bessent seems to be kind of threatening the court to say, you will throw the government into arrears if you do this thing. Neil, what do we think?
Is that true, though? I mean, if this is overturned, is it retroactive in that way, or is this just a threat that Bessent is throwing out there?
Well, I think, in fact, that some months ago, now this is really sloppy of me, and I should have gone back and looked at it, but I think there was a stay put into place, and then another court jumped in and said, no, we're going to let the tariffs go into effect while this makes its way through to the Supreme Court. So we've been operating in this kind of gray area in which presidential authority has been invoked and can be invoked unless the court decides it was wrong, in which case, actually, yes, I think they do have to return the money that they've collected. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, listen, these tariffs are not popular. And I think an example like this of, sort of a small business owner bringing this case forward, you see the real impacts of this. I mean, I think according to what I read around this, they normally pay their costs are around $2 million a year, and with the tariffs, because there are products that their company makes that are pretty much all created in China, they're predicting over $100 million in costs per year. I mean, that is an insane escalation that will render them incapable of continuing on. So where's the job creating Republican Party? Where's the small business entrepreneurial class of the Republican Party? And how does that square with these tariff policies? I feel like it's sort of shocking to me that tariffs weren't a bigger issue in the election. I guess Democrats, we'll talk about this more in a second, but I guess Democrats didn't necessarily need to make them front and center. But this case certainly, I don't think it's going to be a victory for the Trump administration, although this court is often quite, ready to co-sign things. But what do you think is going to happen here in terms of the court decision?
I think the question is, I do think the tariffs are going to be overturned. Court watchers have suggested that a lot of the conservative judges, except for Thomas, were really not happy with the government's case. Interestingly, Neil Katyal, who is a big person commentator on media and so on and so forth, he was the one that brought for the plaintiffs. And it seems like he did great. It seems like the lawyer for the government got a lot of hard questions that he had a lot of difficulty answering. And what seems to be the crux of it is whether the White House can actually interpret the Constitution for themselves, or whether they have to accept interpretations of the Constitution that are set by the court. So I think the interesting thing will be, if it is overturned, is that the moment that Trump turns to the court and says, the court has spoken, now let them enforce it, which, of course, is an old saying that comes to us from, I believe, Andrew Jackson. So who knows? I think it was very clever for them to choose a children's educational toy company for this.
Definitely.
I mean, every single sex toy that's made, that is sold in the United States is made in China too. But you don't want the sex toy people as the lead plaintiffs. Sneakers. Trump sort of poo-pooing and saying, well, maybe the little girls will get $2 and not $35. There are all kinds of ways of characterizing what is made in China as junk. And it's not fair and it's not right, but that is a sort of longstanding prejudice among American consumers. I think the fact that these are educational toys, and what I haven't really seen people speak about is I think the market for products for children really depends on keeping prices low. I've noticed this with children's books. Like, children's books are really, really inexpensive. And the same book that is the same size as an adult book is maybe half the price. And I think it's, that in order to get people to spend on their children, you have to make it affordable. So I think that's a very big issue. I think it's also a big test for the Trump tariff philosophy, which is, well, if you don't want to pay the tariffs, just make it here. Well, you can't build a factory and get it up and running in, a month or so. It takes years to do that. And it takes years to get the workers in place who actually know how to do it. So I do think they are going to overturn it. What will then be interesting is to watch the federal budget blow itself up, because I think it's those tariffs that is paying for ICE. I think it's those tariffs that are paying for the ballroom, that are paying for all of this stuff that is unplanned and unthought about in any serious way.
Yep.
All right, let's get to the topic we really want to talk about, which is elections. All right, Neil, you're in California. I'm in New York. What happened in California?
Big win for Prop 50. I think it was 65% of voters supported it. Not really surprising. I think it was polling well all along.
Remind everyone what Prop 50 was for.
Yeah, Prop 50 was, this Governor Newsom led response to what Texas had done with redistricting. This is a ballot initiative that will redistrict California in a way that's even more favorable for Democrats, which feels like, how could it even be more so? But they're going to squeeze out some more opportunities here. It is not permanent. It is, it's to put it in place until the next census. But this is a clear political response to the efforts in Texas and elsewhere that Republicans have made to start, gerrymandering their states. And I think a lot of people I talked to out here said they didn't love voting for this, but it felt like it was something they had to do. And I think that in a lot of ways, that's how voters feel about this moment in general. Like, they might be supporting folks that they're not necessarily thrilled about, or issues, or, ballot initiatives that they're not necessarily enthusiastic for, but they also understand what's happening on the other side. So that was just sort of a lot of the mood out here.
Well, there was also presidential level turnout for this. And
yes.
The media figures on the East Coast were just kind of marveling and saying all these Californians are voting and there isn't even actually a person on the ballot. It's just an initiative. So I want to go back to what you said, which is that this is temporary. And it is part of a larger redistricting war. Do you think, or what's the talk out there in California, that having pulled this off, it may cause red states to think twice about what they're doing?
Well, I think that was part of the caution that was being expressed out here, was like, okay, if we do this, right, if it's a response to Texas, like, how does this go? Like, does this actually cause other Republican states that weren't necessarily going to look at redistricting to, like, are we just sort of ratcheting up everything and it's just going to be, one after the other? Or is it going to put a little bit of pause on that? I don't know. We'll see. But I do think, like, just what you said about this was like the lone issue. I mean, it was the one thing I voted for on my ballot. I don't know if there were people in other districts here in California who had other things to vote for, but the turnout was amazing. Like, I was seeing so many people posting, their I voted stickers. And so there was an enthusiasm for voting, even if there wasn't necessarily an enthusiasm for voting for this particular issue, if that makes sense. I mean, those are two sort of, you would think they were intimately tied together, but I don't necessarily think so. But like, people were fired up to do this, even if they had some of their own sort of reservations about what it meant.
California Republicans must be furious about this. And I have begun to notice around the country, there are a range of states where the state Republican parties are also pushing back. One of them is Kansas. Kansas has 4 Republican districts and 1 district that's represented by a Democrat. The Democrat, who I believe is a Black woman, said that if she was districted out of her job or redistricted out of her job, then she might just run for Senate. And that was thought to actually give everyone a lot of pause. But Republicans in the state legislature fell a number of votes short of pushing forward a redistricting plan. And so there's some question about whether that's going to happen in Kansas at all. But other states, Republicans are sort of, this does not pass the smell test for them.
Yeah, I think that it'll just be interesting to see. I mean, especially given the results of this Tuesday and the shellacking that I think, Republicans took across the board and every sort of place you could imagine, which we'll get into. I think there should be a lot of real second guessing of the strategies that have led to this moment, and some real navel gazing about what the best path forward is. And we'll see. And it may really vary by state. I mean, I think in some ways this just speaks to the particular context of different places. I mean, you would think that Kansas would be a place in which Republicans could pretty much do what they want, but that's not actually the case. They have a Democratic governor who's very popular. I don't know if we would characterize Kansas as purple, but Democrats do better there than I think people would imagine it without, sort of thinking, deeply about what Kansas politics actually is. So, it could remain highly contextual going forward, but I think a lot remains to be seen about what Republicans take from this election, what the lessons they learned are, and how they apply it.
Well, and Proposition 50 was a real risk for Newsom, too, right?
Definitely.
I mean, talk about how this plays into his national profile and his potential viability as a presidential candidate.
Yeah, I mean, this could have really backfired for him. I mean, I think it probably was always safe to expect that it was going to pass, but I think it was a bit of a question of, like, how strongly will it pass? Is this... and I think if this is something that had only passed with like a slim majority, 52% or 53%, I mean, most folks are pretty happy to take that type of win in today's politics. But in the context of California, that might it certainly, I think, could be read as not a mandate, and in fact, a real pushback on him and sort of his overbearing nature that could be used against him, in a presidential run. But I think that is not the result of this. I mean, I think he can sort of say that he defended democracy, he did what he had to do, and that he's a leader who will fight for the things he cares about. And sometimes you have to break things in order to rebuild them. That's a message that American voters generally don't like, but we live in a completely different historical moment, one that Trump has made. And so I think Trump has allowed for a figure like Newsom to arise too, as we've talked about before, who doesn't necessarily always play by the rules, or who wants to sort of make new rules. I think Newsom is well positioned after this. He was all over this. I mean, he really attached himself to this in his social media and his campaigning. This was his issue, and he was tied to it. He could have paid a real political consequence for it. Republicans will hold this against him for sure, but I don't think that, I'm not sure voters will.
Yeah. Well, and I sort of feel like voters wanted to act last Tuesday. Like everybody was champing at the bit to do something, so that when I saw the reporters interviewing people online in California, lines going around the block.
Absolutely.
And, the reporter kept saying, "You're really seriously just here to vote for a proposition?" Everyone was like, yeah. That there was this sense of collective will and collective desire to do something, even if it meant just voting for a proposition, not a person.
That's right.
So, okay, finally I get to talk about New York. As you know, Neil, I vote in Massachusetts. We had a mayor's election in Massachusetts too, and the incumbent mayor actually won. But being in New York on election day, when New York elected its first Muslim and its first 34-year-old in decades, and the first Democratic Socialist, Zoran Mamdani, as mayor, even though we all knew he was supposed to win, there was this sort of fear that the rug would be snatched out from under his feet by Andrew Cuomo at the last minute. But he did win, and he won by double digits, and he did make it over 50%. And it was just exhilarating, Neil. I cannot tell you how happy people were. And you can see on social media, all the Republicans are just ripshit and bitter. They were posting pictures of 9/11. I mean, it's really disgusting stuff. Nonetheless, it looks like Mamdani is off to a great start. Barack Obama called him the day before the election to say, "Whatever I can do to help you be successful, please tell me." Of course, Obama already had by introducing him to Patrick Gaspard, who ran the campaign. But I now see that there's a whole crew of women around him who are his transition team. So I guess I had a question for you, Neil, which is, how is the news about Mamdani being received in Los Angeles?
Well, I think there's a lot of enthusiasm out here. I mean, Los Angeles society, I think so many people from all over the country have said that this is a race that they were watching closer than, they'd watched a lot of races, like that people were really invested in this story. I think, there's a real enthusiasm for him and an excitement. There's a lot of questions about what this means. Is this a bigger story for the future of the Democratic Party? Is this a particular example in a particular place? Like, we shall see, because I also think if you put Mamdani's win in the context of other Democrats who won, it's not as clear what the message is or the takeaway is of this election, other than I think this is a party that's still putting forward a rather diverse set of candidates who span a little bit more of a spectrum between center left and far left in these high profile races. But certainly it seems like, from what I can see in my, Instagram feed and TikTok, or I'm not on TikTok, on Twitter and all the rest, tons of enthusiasm and excitement for Mamdani. He's got a lot to do, a lot to prove. We'll see how he, how he actually does as mayor.
Yeah, I mean, okay, couple things. One is that New York has some bad experiences with progressive mayors. Some of them have done well. Looking at Fiorello LaGuardia, for example, some of them have become progressively unpopular, like Bill de Blasio, although As a young person reminded me the other day, de Blasio actually did a great many more things for New York than anybody remembers, but he was broadly disliked, particularly by city workers, particularly by the people who worked for him. I mean, I met 3 or 4 people who quit his administration because it was so chaotic and untogether, and they didn't really feel like they could get their work done. So managerial skill will be one critical thing for Mamdani to get hold of. But I think the other interesting thing about this election is if you look at the map, the center of gravity for Democratic voting shifted to Brooklyn.
Yeah, I noticed that too. Yeah.
And that is really a first for New York. It's usually like Manhattan and all the other places. You know that Staten Island, for example, is always going to go for the most conservative candidate. And indeed, Staten Island was the only place where Curtis Sliwa, the Republican candidate, who's actually sort of a dear fellow, got into double digits. Everywhere else, he was in single digits, and the Sliwa voters really went to Andrew Cuomo. But I think what you're saying about the future of the party, I am divided between thinking it's something we really need to talk about, like what kind of candidate will work everywhere, and whether we need to start thinking demographically about what kind of candidate works where. And certainly Mamdani got young people off the couch. He had 100,000 volunteers. Obviously, he had the support of DSA, but DSA is also a fragmented and fractured organization. So that really tells you very little. But he also had the support of major national politicians. Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders stumped for him. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was a big supporter and appeared with him constantly. So there does seem to be some kind of a push to seize back progressivism for the Democratic Party. And I don't know, let's look at some of these other races and see what we see. Other than the Mamdani race, what was the most interesting race to you, Neil?
Well, I think the race in New Jersey was really interesting for me. The governor's race there, Mickey Sherrill won. That race, we were told for months and months and months that it was neck and neck, that it was like a toss-up. And of course, that was creating all sorts of hand-wringing about, the health and viability of the Democratic Party if a governorship in New Jersey was so hard for the Democrat to win. On one hand, that's not really accurate. Republicans often have done well in New Jersey. And so I don't think it should have been assumed all along that, that this is a democratic state and it always is such. That's not what the history shows us. And yet it also seemed concerning that, the polling was showing this race so close given where we are right now. She won in, I think, what anyone would call a landslide, right?
Yeah.
A 13-point healthy victory
13
there.
points. Yep.
Yeah, and I think, the Republicans are trying to say that race, that Republican candidate, it was his weaknesses and it had nothing to do with Trump, that like Trump wasn't the issue there. I think that's an impossible thing to say. Clearly from all the polling, we know that voters were motivated to go out and express their votes in part as anti-Trump choices. So I was just really happy to see the margin of victory there in New Jersey when I thought it was going to be something that was like eked out at like the 2% level.
Totally agree. I mean, there was one poll that was a huge outlier, and I forget, it was like Aptios or, one of those wacky polls that is never right. And they had her winning by 14 points, and they were the one that was right. So there are 2 things that people are talking about here, and I'd be interested as to what you think of them. One is that Trump announcing weeks before the election, like 2 or 3 weeks before the election, that he was going to freeze funding for the Gateway Project, which is a new modernized tunnel that is supposed to go from New Jersey into Manhattan. Currently, we have like 2 train tunnels and we have 2 car tunnels, but this new tunnel, I think, was exclusively for trains, and it was intended to make the commute between New Jersey and New York faster, smoother, more efficient, all modern equipment. Since Hurricane Sandy, when all of those tunnels flooded, it's just been a constant whack-a-mole to try and keep them up. So the Gateway Project was funded by Joe Biden, which is why Trump canceled it. But doing that 2 to 3 weeks before the election, if you looked at the really big results that came in fast, they were those counties of people who commute into New York. Yeah. It really pissed them off. And I think it kind of shows Trump's limitations as someone who's never lived a real life like an ordinary person. People who commute are desperate right now.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Our infrastructure is for the birds. There are too many cars on the roads. In New York, they have instituted congestion pricing, which is basically a good thing, but it means that people are pushed into buses and trains that are already overcrowded and late and broken half the time. So I think that was a terrible mistake. The second thing that was going on, and this may have ramifications out where you are, Neil, is that apparently Mikey Sherrill clawed back 2 categories of Trump voters. One was young men who were declared lost to us less than 6 months ago. And we should talk a little about young men, because I don't really get it why people can't focus on young men as real people with real desires that could be satisfied. But the other group was Latinos. And one of the things that nearly pushed New Jersey into the Trump camp in the last election was a large Latino vote voting for him. I think it was an economic vote. And so what we're beginning to see, I think, there, and then we should talk about Virginia, because that's a different problem, is Trump voters saying, well, we voted for you to fix the economy. You haven't fixed the economy.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. I mean, there's one particular county in New Jersey that the name is escaping me right now, that has a very large, I think it has the largest Hispanic population or concentration in the state. Trump had won there. Trump had won it in 2024, and it was a double-digit swing for Sherrill in this rate. So I think that is a snapshot of bigger things that are happening all across the country that, like, probably Tuesday's races, didn't fully capture because of, just the nature of where they were taking place. But this is a really important point you made about the way in which a year in, folks are very aware of what this administration has done and how it showed up in their lives. It has not made them more economically strong. It hasn't put more money back in their wallets. It hasn't lowered cost. In fact, it's done the opposite of all those things, while it's also terrorized their lives, their communities, their family members, and created chaos. And so, yeah, I think that it's not surprising to see these great swings, because you had a lot of people who, especially from sort of demographic groups that don't typically vote for a Republican candidate, you had a lot of them sort of go out on a limb here and extend some trust to Trump that he was going to deliver on economic matters that meant something to him. And so it's nice to see voters responding so quickly to the real conditions on the ground.
Yeah, I agree with you. So speaking of economics, then let's shift to Virginia, where Abigail Spanberger was expected to win, and she did win. The person who wasn't expected to win was Jay Jones, the attorney general candidate challenging an incumbent attorney general. Jones got mired in a texting scandal where I won't repeat what was said in the text, but essentially he was seen to be condoning murderous violence against Republican politicians. It was very, very ugly, very stupid. And I thought I predicted it was going to take him down. And he appears either to have been swept in on Spanberger's coattails, or voters in Virginia are so angry at this point that they will vote blue no matter who. What do you think was going on in that race?
Yeah, I think it was the power of the blue choice in this that, benefited him. He certainly didn't do as well as Spanberger did, but I think he only was like 4 points behind her in her margin of victory. So am I remembering right that she won by like 13% and he won by 9? Am I getting those numbers rough?
Yeah.
Okay.
Which 9 is actually huge.
That's an enormous victory.
Climate.
Yes, exactly. You would love that in any moment, especially right now. 9% is a lot. It shows that 4% of voters in Virginia, felt like, we can assume that like this text message issue was what caused them to split their vote, right? But there was such a huge margin of support for Democrats running for office in Virginia that it barely impacted him. He still had almost a double-digit win. So I also think like the text he sent is horrific and horrible. It also feels a bit par for the course of what we hear, from Trump and Trump affiliates, variations of the same thing. And so I don't know what can disqualify you from politics anymore, but a text message that says this in light of everything else that's happened, clearly that was the decision that a lot of voters made. Like they wrote this off. I don't think it was an issue of them not knowing about it because it got a ton of attention, but I also think there were a lot of voters who went to the ballot box and they just bubbled in D down the line. And I think that is an expression of the larger political climate rather than an endorsement of each individual politician.
Yeah, I agree with you. And Virginia is kind of swinging anyway. I mean, traditionally what we see is whatever party is voted in for the presidency the following year, Virginia votes for the opposite party for governor. I don't know whether they do this consciously or whether they just do it or whether it's some kind of group madness that they engage in. But this went further than that. I mean, Democrats really ran the table in Virginia. It wasn't just governor and attorney general. In Virginia, the lieutenant governor you vote for separately. So the lieutenant governor's position was won by Ghazala Hashimi, who will be the first Muslim and the first Indian American to win statewide office in Virginia. And I think she's the first female Muslim to win statewide office in the United States.
Wow.
And then Democrats expanded their representation in the House of Delegates as well, which will hand Spanberger a mechanism for really making some changes. We haven't talked about the effect of the massive government layoffs in Virginia, but it had to have made a difference, right, Neil?
Absolutely. Think about just tens of thousands of, if not, tens of thousands of workers who live in that Northern Virginia area, who work for the federal government, who've been laid off or who've been made like very vulnerable in this moment. And the reverberations of that across hundreds of thousands, if not, probably 1 million plus people that make up those Northern Virginia counties. It's also decimating house prices in the area. I mean, there's real, obviously, economic consequence for this sort of broad policy decision to lay off so many workers and to threaten, the future work of those who still are unemployed. And so I think that's, those counties are really important because of how populous they are. But I also think if you look at a map of Virginia, if you look at a map of any election in this on Tuesday, every single voting center skewed either slightly to heavily blue. I mean, literally the skewing is just going in a strong direction in all sorts of different demographic and population areas. So yes, it's the Northern Virginia consequences of what's happening in this first year of the Trump administration. Certainly, I think were a huge part of how Virginia went, but Virginia voters across that state decided to side with Democrats. And I think that's also important for us to think about here as well.
Do you think it's fair to say that Virginia is no longer a purple state, it's really a blue state?
Well, it doesn't seem like it should be considered a purple state. I do think, this is a state where the governor only can run for one term.
Right.
And so I think that sort of peculiarity or that uniqueness allows for a little bit more variability in terms, right? Like there's not an incumbent in that position running and having all the sort of strength of the incumbents that might also shape whether or not how we characterize Virginia, right? Like if there was if there was a Republican governor who was able to, sort of convince voters to stick with him or her because, they have the sort of power of the office, it might change how the state appeared politically. Like, it might look a little more purple. That assumes that a Republican governor could win re-election right now, and I don't think he could. But yeah, it doesn't seem like, if it's purple, it's like a purple with a really, really blue tint at this point. I think North Carolina is the one that has moved back into the more, actually maybe not even purple anymore, sort of back into the red category, which is a little bit more of a surprise because it looked solidly purple for a while. I mean, it didn't have any elections for us to really talk about now, but like there was a lot of, sort of comparison of Virginia and North Carolina in recent years of which was like the more purple, which was the leaning more blue. It seems like Virginia now is closer to blue. If North Carolina is purple, it's a purple with a huge, huge, huge red hue.
Well, and I know Republicans had great fantasies about flipping New Jersey. I mean, I've been watching the political consultants on X for the last year talking about the large number of Republican registrations, that, Republicans were like 300,000 ahead in their registrations. And although they hadn't caught up to Democrats, they were getting there. And there was really a hunger to take New Jersey, which I think because Trump did so well there in 2024, they really thought they could do. So that has been thwarted. The Republican failure to stop Proposition 50 in California has thwarted another plan, or at least made the redistricting thing a much less certain way of getting in the way of a Democratic victory in 2026. We also have Pennsylvania, which has this weird system for the state Supreme Court where every 10 years the voters have to vote to retain the justices in the state Supreme Court, which I actually think is not a terrible idea. I wish we could do that with, SCOTUS, but we can't. So anyway, there was a huge push by Republicans to unseat those justices, in part because the Pennsylvania legislature, one part of it is Democratic by a very thin margin. One part of it is Republican by a very thin margin. And it is the legislature that can seat new justices. So it's a very strange system. So I think part of what Republicans were hoping is that they could get those justices unseated and then leave those seats vacant for the next 3 years and do all kinds of dirty in the 26 election and the 2028 election. That failed. But I did notice one thing. As you know, my mother lives outside Philadelphia. She was getting the most disgusting mailers about the Supreme Court, many of which just openly said, I'm not kidding, these people are pedophiles. Wow. And they support other pedophiles. They actually said this. And Crazy. So that leaves me to another question for you, Neil, which is, do you think Americans are getting a little sick of being hit over the head with men and women's sports and, all of the sort of culture wars rhetoric? Do you think they're kind of saying we're over that, we don't want to do that anymore, and we actually want some attention to business?
I mean, I'm not sure Americans were really ever into that as much as Republicans were. And I think that like a lot of the polling shows that this may be not a viable path for Republicans anymore either, that it's not stirring up the base anymore, that actually too many of Republican voters or Republican potential voters are actually being turned off by those very things, especially in light of everything else that's happening. So I think you can easily overplay the culture wars hand, especially if it's the only play you're making, and also if that's happening where we're in sort of economic free fall and people feel like they don't have security when it comes to, their earnings and they see costs going up. Yeah, Republicans need to really choose a different strategy here. The fear mongering, the culture wars baiting has dwindling return. Hopefully they get the message and sort of get back to real issues that matter. I'm not sure they will. We'll see if the anti-trans stuff gets ramped up after this.
Yep.
Democrats actually didn't back away from it, who ran this in this race, and none of them were punished for it. So I think that's an important takeaway as well.
Yeah, particularly as we see some Democratic groups saying, enough with the identity politics, right?
And also media figures who keep telling them that this is the issue they need to back up from. I mean, I think that Democrats should really look at these results. They shouldn't sort of overthink them or overimagine what they mean, because I do think they really vary, in one race to another in terms of why those Democrats won. But I think sort of taking their marching orders from the chattering classes of media folk is probably not the best strategy for going forward.
Yep. Hard agree. So let's give a nod to some other results from Tuesday. In Maine, voters rejected a shorter early voting period and a voter ID requirement. And they also approved a red flag gun control law. In Colorado, voters approved a tax on high earners to fund free meals for all public school students. 5 will get you 10. That one's going to the Supreme Court. And in Mississippi, Democrats have secured 2 more seats in the state Senate, ending a decade-long Republican supermajority. Go Mississippi. What do you think are the big factors that went into the Democrats' big night, Neil?
Well, this is, an off-year election, right? So I think one of the things that's clear is even in places where there was high voter turnout, which is the case in New York and in California, a lot of election analysts are pointing out that these off-year elections, especially when, a presidential candidate like Trump isn't on the ballot, they really skew who turns out. And that really all elections are about turnout at this point. People are pretty baked into their political identity and their political affiliation. And so now it's about turnout. And the interesting thing that I think a lot of folks have observed, and also to different states, I don't know if this applies to Mississippi, but in a lot of the different states, is that Democrats have captured sort of middle class and upper middle class suburbanites. And those used to be a solid block for the Republican Party.
Yep.
And the important thing about that is not necessarily the political swing, but that those are active voters. People who sort of always turn out. So if that's the demographic that's most inclined to consistently vote, and if there has been a party swing there that we've now seen happen sort of over probably a decade-long period, that's a real takeaway of this. I think the real questions are how much of this is transferable to that 4-year national election context. I don't know. This is definitely a good sign. This is a great moment, right?
Yeah.
This is as much hope, I think, as we can take out of the political moment of right now as one can imagine, because, the alternative here would have been absolutely crushing. This is a great takeaway. Hopefully it's good news for the midterms. What it means for, the 2028 race, I think is still an open question.
Yep. Totally agree. All right, let's leave it there and tamp down our excitement about politics until next week, and let's talk about what we want to go viral, Neil. What do you want to go viral this week?
What I want to go viral this week is a new podcast series called The Alabama Murders. I devoured it. I think there's one episode that's yet to be released. Oh, no, I actually just downloaded it this morning. But I've yet to listen to it. But I listened to all the ones I can. It's produced by Malcolm Gladwell, I have to say. And I will say, I'm not a huge Malcolm Gladwell fan. We don't need to go down that rabbit hole, but, he's someone who I always read his New Yorker pieces and usually have a bit of a mixed reaction to them. But anyway, he's the host of this. I love this podcast. It's about a 1988 murder in Florence, Alabama. A Church of Christ pastor murdered his wife, or I'll just say it has to do with a preacher, his wife, murder. You should listen to all the different, I don't want to spoil it too much, but it's a complicated case in the way that, these murder stories often are that we listen to. The thing that's so powerful about it is, well, first of all, it does a really nice job in providing a history of the Church of Christ, which is this small but really important denomination that's really strong through sort of the Mid-South. Alabama, Arkansas, Western Tennessee has a really fascinating history. The podcast does a nice job with that. But the thing that's so incredible about this podcast, and I really urge folks to listen to, is the history of the death penalty that it is able to build through these episodes, and particularly the rise of lethal injections. and how those come to be used in so many states as their way of carrying out the death penalty. And one of the things that the podcast touches on is that lethal injections in a lot of ways were the consequence of anti-death penalty advocates sort of arguing that the current methods, particularly electrocution, were cruel and unusual punishment. And so the push to move to lethal injections was a bit of a compromise to sort of bring about, I guess, a more humane way of doing this. And it turns out it isn't humane either. There's some just incredible medical history or medical testimony that goes into understanding how this is actually used that I found really, really fascinating to learn. And I think, the podcast really explores this question of, and this is from the podcast website itself, our efforts to alleviate suffering often make it worse.
Wow.
And so it's just really worth listening to. And it's called The Alabama Murders. I believe the last episode just dropped this week, so you can binge it.
Wow. Thank you so much, Neil. It's particularly interesting at this moment. I mean, isn't it the case that part of why people could claim they did not know that injection was painful is that the first drug that they inject essentially paralyzes the person? And
that's exactly it.
Yeah, the prisoner was unable to express pain.
Yes. Yeah. And then so they have this medical examiner who has spent so many years researching this, and you can look at the body and you can actually see physical evidence that shows that there's actually an extreme duress that the body is placed under and really torturous circumstances, and it's just really harrowing. But yes, the person is rendered incapable of expressing any of that, and that's been part that's a part of this.
Yeah. And of course, it's something that's very difficult to use as an argument now because so many people seem to believe that people who have done terrible things deserve to die in pain. And so there isn't as much of a plausible moral argument to make in the public sphere about cruelty.
Mm-hmm.
Because cruelty is now so much a part of our political culture.
Yes.
Okay, looking forward to listening to that, Neil. The thing I want to go viral this week is an article by a guy named David Herbert. And the name is She Was Ready to Have Her 13th Child. Then Came the Felony Charges. It was in the New York Times Magazine, November 2nd, last weekend. And it's about a woman named Mary Beth Lewis who develops a determination as she ages out of her childbearing years to keep having children. So she was one of those women who loved being pregnant, loved having babies around, had baby after baby after baby. Then she gets into her 40s and the children are really growing up. And she says, I want more. So she has children through IVF, carries her last child to term when she's almost 60 years old. Meanwhile, the older children, and they're almost all girls, are taking care of the younger children at home. There's one child in particular who really sort of becomes the alternate mother. The husband is a pilot for Federal Express, and he, is almost never home, but he's earning a big enough salary that he can do this or pay for all of this. And then in the final analysis, are you laughing?
My dog is doing funny things behind me. Okay. Sorry. Not laughing at the topic. Toby has just decided to. Weird. Yes.
And so she decides she's going to try it one more time, and she hires a surrogate, buys some eggs, buys some sperm, has the surrogate impregnated, and then does not tell her husband. So he's flying around for Federal Express, and he comes home. He realizes that they are having 2 more babies after the babies are born. And he flips the fuck out and tells everybody at the hospital, I never authorized this. I never signed those papers. I never, and she had gone through all these sort of elaborate, fraudulent things to, assert that her husband had agreed to this. At which point, Child Protective Services gets involved. The babies are whisked away, sent to a foster family. And so for the last 2 years, there has been litigation in which Mary Lewis has been trying to get these children back. And it looks like she's going to get them back. So she will now have a total of 15 children, I think, something like that. And it raises all sorts of, first of all, it's just weird. It's like she's a hoarder of children.
Yeah.
And then you ask yourself, well, is it so weird to love children so much that you want to keep having them? And I don't actually know whether it's that weird or not. We do know it's wrong to defraud people. We do know that she actually has no biological or physical relationship to these children because of the surrogate and the purchase of the egg and the sperm and so on. But it generated a huge conversation on a feminist listserv I was on about what exactly she had done wrong, except being overly in love with children and just wanting more and more of them, regardless of the effect that it actually had on her husband or the children she had. So anyway, this should go viral because it's just too weird. And I want people to think about it because I think it raises a lot of questions about how deregulated IVF is.
Yeah.
About how easy it is if you have money just to make babies and take them home. But it's not easy to adopt and it's not easy to foster. So there are a series of values and practicalities about what it means to have children that are really in conflict in this case.
It just sounds fascinating. I want to read that immediately. And the questions you raised are fascinating too. I do think, it could be said that having children isn't the same thing as loving the children that you have.
Good
and
point.
That seems important here.
Yeah. Yeah. No, there is an aspect of this that seems like collecting. And then on the other hand, what I wouldn't want to see is to have surrogacy so regulated that people who need surrogacy to have children don't have access to it. Gay men are an obvious category of people, but also women who can't carry a child to term. So we don't want to see this kind of thing regulated out of existence, but it does seem like there's a big gap here that somebody legal needs to fill in, I think. Okay, so I recommend that everybody read that. It's called She Was Ready to Have Her 15th Child, Then Came the Felony Charges by David Herbert in the New York Times. We'll link to it in our show notes. And Neil, I think that's it for today.
That's it.
Okay, have a good week, my friend, and I'll see you next week.
You too. Take care.
And that's it for today's show. Thanks for hanging out with us. Share this podcast with a friend who loves history, politics, and smart conversation. You can follow Neil and me on Threads, Blue Sky, X, TikTok, and Instagram. Go to the Political Junkie Substack at clairepotter.substack.com for show notes, more episodes, to leave a comment or question, to subscribe for free, or to support our work for as little as $5 a month. You can also subscribe for free by searching for us on your favorite platform. If you do, please leave a rating and a comment so that other listeners can find us. Our podcast is supported by the New School for Social Research and by paying subscribers. Political Junkie is written, recorded, edited, and produced by me, Claire Potter. Today's theme is Shakedown by Soul Shifters. You can find their work and all the talented artists we feature on these episodes on Soundstripe. That's all for now. See you next week.